"Pick it up," Daniel Brooks said, flicking the employee badge off Marcus Reed's chest like it didn't belong there, the plastic skidding across the polished floor and stopping just short of Marcus's boots as a few heads turned and quickly looked away, the hum of printers and keyboards thinning into a tight, uneasy silence, and Daniel straightened his cuff as if the moment needed no explanation, as if power alone made it right. Marcus didn't move, didn't bend, just stood there with the faint smell of cardboard and dust still clinging to his jacket from the loading dock, eyes steady, breath measured, while overhead lights reflected cold and sharp against the glass walls. And somewhere behind Daniel, a contract folder lay open on the table, one signature away from something no one in that room fully understood yet, except the man he had just told to stay in his place. Marcus Reed had been in the building long before the first executive badge ever tapped against the glass doors, long before the conference room lights came alive in clean white rows, his shift starting at 5:30 in the morning when the city outside still carried the quiet weight of dawn and delivery trucks idled like distant thunder along the curb. He moved through aisles of stacked boxes with steady hands, scanning labels, correcting mismatched codes, fixing small errors no one upstairs ever noticed, but that kept everything from falling apart. His name rarely spoken unless something needed to be carried or cleaned or quietly handled, and even then it came without eye contact, without acknowledgement, just a gesture, a nod, a passing instruction that assumed he would comply without question, and he always did, not because he lacked pride, but because he understood timing, understood that speaking too early in a place like this could cost more than just a job, yet beneath the worn fabric of his jacket was a mind that tracked patterns, shipments, numbers, discrepancies, details that slipped past people who believed titles made them infallible. And now as he stood in that polished room with his badge still lying on the floor between them, he could already see it, the error sitting inside that open folder behind Daniel. Quiet, dangerous, and about to become very real. Daniel let out a short laugh that did not reach his eyes, the kind that made a few people in the room shift in their seats before quickly forcing small, polite smiles, and he stepped forward just enough to close the distance, not touching Marcus, but making it clear who owned the space. "You see, this is exactly the problem," he said, loud enough for the entire room to hear, his voice carrying across glass and steel. People step out of their lane and suddenly think they belong in conversations they do not understand. A couple of junior analysts exchanged glances, one of them lowering his gaze to his tablet as if it could hide him. Another let out an awkward chuckle that died too quickly, and Daniel gestured toward the door without even looking at Marcus. "You are here to move boxes, not to interrupt executive decisions. So do your job and leave this room to people who actually know what they are doing." The words hung heavy, sharper than they needed to be, and no one spoke, no one stepped in, the silence turning thick as eyes avoided Marcus. Not out of agreement, but out of habit, the kind that lets disrespect pass without resistance, while the open folder behind Daniel sat untouched, waiting, its pages still carrying a mistake that was now one signature closer to becoming irreversible. Marcus bent slowly, not in submission but in control, picking up the badge from the floor as the plastic edge pressed lightly into his palm, the room watching without admitting it. And for a second it looked like he would turn and walk out like everyone expected, like the script had already been written for him. But he did not move toward the door. Instead he took one step forward, careful, measured, his voice low but steady enough to cut through the silence. "Sir, the shipment in that file is flagged under a duplicate routing code. If that contract is signed as it is, the liability shifts entirely to this company." A pause followed, sharp and immediate, like the air itself resisted what he had just said, and Daniel's expression hardened, not confused but irritated, the kind of irritation that comes from being challenged in front of an audience. "Are you still talking?" he said, louder now, turning slightly so the room could hear him again, reinforcing the hierarchy that had just been threatened. "Do you understand how far out of line you are right now?" One of the senior associates shifted in his chair, glancing briefly at the open folder before quickly looking away, while another leaned back, folding his arms as if distancing himself from what was happening, and Daniel stepped closer, his voice dropping but somehow carrying even more weight. "You do not get to walk into this room and pretend you know something the rest of us do not." The pressure in the room tightened, invisible but heavy, pressing down on Marcus from every direction, expectation, judgment, dismissal, all at once. Yet he did not raise his voice, did not step back, only held his ground as the untouched document behind Daniel sat there, silent and dangerous, one decision away from becoming a mistake no one could undo. Daniel exhaled sharply and reached for the pen on the table, the motion deliberate, almost theatrical, like he needed the room to see that he was still in control, still the one making decisions, and the faint scratch of the pen against the paper seemed louder than it should have been in the silence. Marcus's eyes did not leave the document, did not leave Daniel's hand, and then he spoke again, quieter this time, but somehow harder to ignore. "Are you sure you want to do that?" The question landed differently, not defiant, not emotional, just precise. And for a fraction of a second, Daniel's hand paused, the tip of the pen hovering just above the signature line. And that was when he hesitated, not because of Marcus, at least that is what he told himself, but because something in the room had shifted, a weight pressing in from nowhere. One of the executives leaned forward slightly, eyes flicking to the clause, then back to Daniel, waiting, and the stillness stretched just long enough to feel wrong. Daniel forced a small breath through his nose and pressed the pen down harder than necessary, as if pressure alone could erase the hesitation that had just betrayed him. But his eyes drifted for a fraction of a second back to the page, scanning the lines he had already approved earlier that morning. And something there no longer sat as comfortably as it had before, a clause buried in dense wording, clean on the surface but slightly misaligned in structure, subtle enough to pass unnoticed unless someone had spent time actually tracking how shipments moved, how liability shifted when routes overlapped across state lines, how a single duplicated code could reroute responsibility without changing a single visible number. And Marcus saw it in Daniel's face, that flicker, that almost invisible tightening around the eyes that said doubt had entered the room whether it was welcome or not. One of the executives cleared his throat softly and leaned in just enough to glance again at the document, fingers hovering over the edge of the table, not touching, not interfering, but no longer completely certain either, while Marcus remained still, not stepping closer, not raising his voice, just watching, because this was no longer about being heard. It was about letting the truth surface on its own, and Daniel shifted his weight slightly, the confidence in his posture adjusting by degrees, so small no one would call it out. Yet everyone could feel it, the room no longer fully aligned behind him, the silence now carrying a different kind of tension, one that did not come from authority but from the possibility that something had already gone wrong, and that the person he had just dismissed might be the only one who had seen it before it was too late. The sound of the door opening did not slam or echo. It simply cut through the room like a line drawn too clean to ignore, and every head turned at once as Laura Whitman stepped inside, her presence quiet but absolute, the kind that did not need introduction, and her eyes moved past Daniel without pause, landing directly on Marcus. "Why is he not at the table?" she asked, not loudly, but with a precision that made the question feel heavier than any raised voice. Daniel straightened immediately, words forming too quickly. "He is not part of this meeting." But Laura did not look at him. Not yet. Her gaze remained fixed. "Marcus Reed flagged a routing liability issue in our Midwest chain 3 months ago that saved this company over $12 million. The room shifted, subtle but undeniable. Chairs creaked. Someone's pen rolled off the table, and no one reached for it. And Daniel's hand lowered slowly from the document, the pen no longer touching the page, while Laura finally turned to him, calm, controlled. "He is here because I asked him to observe this exact contract." And then her eyes dropped briefly to the badge, still in Marcus's hand. "And if he says there is a problem, then the problem is already real." The silence that followed was no longer tense. It was final, and Daniel's authority did not disappear in a moment. It unraveled, thread by thread, in front of everyone who had just watched him be wrong. Daniel's fingers loosened around the pen as it rolled slowly across the table, the faint sound marking the end of something he could not recover, and no one in the room moved to help him. No one rushed to fill the silence this time, because the hierarchy had already shifted without permission. Laura closed the folder with a quiet firmness and slid it away from him. "We will review this properly," she said, calm and final. And that was all it took. Daniel stepped back half a pace, not told to, but because there was nowhere left to stand, while Marcus finally placed his badge back against his chest, clipping it in place with a soft click that somehow carried more weight than any raised voice. Before, and as he walked past the table, no one stopped him, no one questioned him, because in that room, respect had already changed direction, and this time, it was not something that could be taken back.